What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're having a look at a crazy game played between Fabiano Caruana, a perennial top 5 player in the world, and of course, the GOAT of chess, Magnus Carlsen, and this game did take place in the 2023 CCT Finals. All right, in the game, we have 1e4 by Fabiano Caruana, then e5 by Magnus, then knight f3, knight c6, and finally bishop c4. The Italian game is the weapon of choice for today's game. Now here, Magnus continues, knight f6, d3, and then bishop c5, getting the other Italian-style bishop out into the game. Now, Fabiano, how does he want to play this? Well, normally, the main moves here are c3 and short castles, but instead here, Fabiano does go bishop g5, pinning that knight on f6 to the queen on the d8 square. All right, Magnus, how does he want to counter this? He goes h6, driving back that bishop. We have bishop h4, and then here, black has a lot of different options. The main move, of course, is just d6, intending a6 or a5, and black will have a perfectly fine game, as that bishop on h4 isn't really ideally placed. Now, instead of that here, Magnus does go bishop e7, retreating his bishop back to the e7 square and breaking the pin of the bishop on the knight to the queen. Now, the point of this move, bishop e7, he is trying to retreat his bishop back to the e7 square, again, breaking that pin before going d6. That way, the bishop will be inside the pawn chain. Now, this move is a little bit dubious. It's not nearly as strong as, say, d6 followed by a6, queen to e7, and so on. But here, Magnus mixing things up in this game. All right, now, Fabiano, he knows exactly what to do. He goes bishop g3, applying pressure to that pawn on e5. Now, knight takes e5 is being threatened, and here, Magnus will have to respond with the move d6 defending. All right, now, Fabiano, he plays the move a4, and this is a very typical move in the Italian game in all kinds of lines, and it turns out it is also the strongest idea here, and believe it or not, white is already threatening ideas based on a5, maybe even a6. We'll have to wait and see how black will counter that. All right, now, Magnus here, he's got a lot of different options. You can castle, or you can initiate counterplay immediately, perhaps with g5 or even bishop e6, opposing the white light-squared Italian-style bishop on c4. Now, here, black does castle. Short castles is the move by Magnus. And now here again, Fabiano has a lot of different options. For example, c3, castles, knight d2 are all playable. But instead, as promised, Fabiano continues with the plan of aggressively expanding on the queen side with the move a5. Now, the benefit of this pawn, it does clamp down on the queen side, clamping down on ideas like, for example, b6, b5, and so on. And also, white does have access to the a4 square, and that could be useful later in the game for the bishop, the rook, or the queen. All right, now here, Magnus, in this position, he's not messing around. He just goes bishop e6, challenging white's light-squared bishop on c4 immediately. The idea being, yes, white has the option of trading on e6, but if black recaptures back with the f-pawn, yes, he will have those double pawns on the e6 and e5 squares. However, those pawns will control a lot of important squares in the center, and overall, black will be relatively okay. Now here, Fabiano, fortunately for us, he does trade on e6. Bishop takes e6 is the move. It's not forced. You can leave the bishop there. You can go knight d2 or even bishop e5, but instead, bishop takes played in the game. Now we have f takes, and now as promised, we have that very interesting pawn structure with the black pawns on e6 and e5, controlling a lot of squares, but of course, that pawn on e6 in particular will be very weak throughout this game, and white may even have ideas based on, for example, queen to b3 later, trying to target it. All right, now here, Fabiano Caruana, he has a big choice. Well, obviously, there is the choice of castling versus not castling, but beyond that, white has the choice. Do you want to go knight c3, just playing very typical chess, maybe intending d4 in central play, or do you want to go c2 to c3, occupying that square with the pawn, intending d4 with the pawn on d4, supported by the c3 pawn? That would be the more ambitious choice, and again, fortunately for us, that was played in the game. So, c3, the very typical Italian style move. And now here, white, he's planning for central play based on perhaps d4, maybe even b4, b5, and so on, playing in the center and on the queen side. Meanwhile, Magnus Carlsen, he may be counterattacking on the king side, perhaps with ideas based on, I don't know, queen d7, doubling up rooks on the f file, maybe knight h5 to f4, and so on, maybe even g5, depending on how the game progresses. All right, now here, it is Magnus Carlsen's turn to move, and before before initiating play on the king side, he does play a very provocative move. That is the move b5, immediately moving the pawn 2 squares forward and giving white the chance to recapture en passant. Now, would that be a good idea for white? Should white recapture en passant like this right here? If you're not familiar, whenever one side moves a pawn 2 squares forward next to the enemy pawn, you can recapture on the diagonal like this, as if the pawn went 1 square forward instead of 2. Now, is that a good idea here or not? It's a good time for a pause. We'll go and pause the video right now and try to figure out, is recapturing en passant the right strategic idea for Fabiano Caruana right here in this position? And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out a ton. All right, here it turns out a takes b6 is not the right way forward. The problem with that move is after a takes, then a takes, black would be able to seize control of the open a file sooner or later. The rooks would be opposing. For example, if white takes on a8, black recaptures with the queen, and all of a sudden he is dominating that open a file, and he would have decent counterplay on the queen side. So instead of that here, Fabiano plays a very interesting move, queen to b3, seemingly targeting both the pawn on b5 and the pawn on e6. And here, it's almost impossible for black to properly defend both those pawns with a single piece. So here, Magnus seemingly winning material, but Fabiano seemingly winning material, but all is not lost for the GOAT. Here, he just goes queen d7, staying cool, calm, and collected, defending that pawn on e6. Of course, if you don't do that, let's say you go a6, then queen takes e6, winning the pawn with check would give white a massive advantage. So instead, queen d7 played in the game, and here's the idea. The queen defends e6, and now if you take on b5, that is actually a reasonable move. The problem with that, or the drawback rather, is black can go rook f to b8, and as soon as the queen moves, say to a4 or c4, then rook takes b2, regains the pawn immediately, and black would be doing relatively fine with good counterplay on the open b file on the queen side. So instead of that here, Fabiano does castle. Short castles was played in the game, a very reasonable move, and now Magnus does go a6. And now he has that typical closed Roy Lopez style pawn structure on the queen side with those pawns on a6 and b5. And overall here, black is doing relatively okay, and we're going to have a very tense middle game on our hands. All right, Fabiano continues. Knight bd2, the standard square for that knight in these Italian style positions with the pawn on c3. Now, Magnus, how does he want to proceed? Well, you can get the other rook into play. For example, rook a to c8, rook a d8, or even rook f7, then rook a to f8. Instead here, Magnus does go for active play with the knight immediately. He goes knight h5, threatening both knight takes g3, winning that dark squared bishop, or even knight to f4, and that knight would be wonderfully placed on f4. Of course, if you ever take it, black is going to have the option of recapturing with that double pawn on the e-file, therefore undoubling those pawns. So that knight will be just a monster on f4 if it does indeed get there. All right, Fabiano, of course, he is not out of this game. He even has a small advantage here. He goes rook fd1, potentially intending a very fast d4 advance. However, the drawback of this move, the rook is no longer controlling f2, and therefore black may have some uncomfortable pressure on that f-file. All right, now Magnus, he continues, g5, gaining space on the king side here, and again, further bolstering that knight if it ever does go to the very important f4 square. All right, Fabiano, how does he want to deal with this? Well, it turns out knight f4 is not the only threat here. Black is also threatening g4, driving back that knight on f3. And again, with the rook no longer on f1, no longer guarding f2, that would get very dangerous very fast. For example, if white goes, say, d4 or knight f1, those are the other two decent moves. Then g4 immediately drives back that knight, and black would be fighting for the initiative. So instead here, h3 was played with by Fabiano, a very shrewd move. The idea being you are stopping g4 ideas temporarily, as that would lose a pawn on the spot. All right, now here, Magnus, it turns out the best move for him is a little bit counterintuitive. According to the engine, you actually want to go bishop to f6. The idea being you increase the mobility of the queen to slide over to the king side, potentially on f7, and maybe that bishop would go to g7, where it's a little bit better placed. Now, instead of that here, knight f4 was played in the game, and it turns out this is a little bit premature for Magnus. The problem here is white has the option of trading on f4 immediately, and that is what Fabiano does. So Bishop takes f4 played in the game, and now no matter how black recaptures, white is going to be doing excellent. For example, if he takes with the e-pawn, e takes f4, that would be a very dubious move. Then d4 would be very strong for white. Instead, if he goes, say, g takes f4, then knight to h2 would be the right move, intending knight d to f3, maybe knight g4 in the future if the opportunity arises, and white overall would have a very good defensive setup. If black ever attacks on the g file, white could go, say, king to h1, rook g1, and so on, and he would be defending just fine. Now, instead, rook takes f4 played in the game, recapturing with the rook, a seemingly solid move, but here Fabiano, he is ready to strike in the center. d4, as they say, the best way to respond to an attack on the flank is an attack in the center, and here Fabiano is threatening d takes e5. That would expose black's pawns in the center. For example, after d takes, those pawns on e6 and e5 would be doubled, isolated, very weak, and the d file would be opening up to Fabiano's benefit. Therefore, d takes e5 is a very serious threat here. And what is Magnus going to do about it? Well, for now, he actually ignores that threat and just goes rook a to f8, doubling up the rooks on the f-file. Now there are a lot of potential sacrificial ideas on f3 if this knight on d2 ever does move. But here Fabiano, he is not done. He simply goes d5. Now, very importantly, that other tactic of, say, d takes e5 here isn't as good as black can recapture with the knight. And then if you ever go knight takes e5, then you open up the f-file and black would have a lot of activity. So instead of that, here, rook a to f8 played in the game, and then instead of d takes e5, white does go d5, and this turns out to be the strongest move here. You are forking both the knight and the pawn on e6. That is very dangerous. For example, if black takes with the pawn, e takes d5, then you recapture the pawn of your own, and all of a sudden you gain access to e4 for the knight, and white would have a very large initiative. Instead of that here, knight d8 played in the game, defending both the knight and bolstering the defense of the pawn on e6, a very solid move. And now here, it turns out Fabiano has a very simple move to seize control of the game yet again. That move is going to be c4. It's a multi-purpose move. One, you are trying to gain space on the queen side and open up more lines of attack, but two, you also open up the queen's access on the third rank to slide over, and maybe even rook to a3 ideas. The rook lift on the third rank could come into play later in the game. Now, instead of that, knight f1 played by Fabiano Caruana, and this turns out to be quite a bit weaker, and here Magnus does seize control immediately. He starts h5, intending a very fast g4, a very precise idea. Now we have knight e3. That was the idea of knight f1. The knight is going to the e3 square, where it bolsters all of these very important light squares in the white position. But now g4 comes anyway by Magnus. Magnus is attacking on the king side. He has turned the game around. Now we have h takes, and knight to h2, dropping that knight back. And now here black has the option of picking up that loose pawn on the f2 square. But here is the big question. Is rook takes f2 actually a good idea in this position, or should black be doing something else? Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to solve that one for yourself right here. Well, it turns out rook takes f2 is not the best way forward. Instead, bishop to g5 is the right way forward. Again, freeing up the queen to slide over to the king side, perhaps on f7, tripling up the pieces on the f file. That would be the right way forward. Now, instead, rook takes f2 played in the game, and here is the problem with this move. Here, white can simply go knight e takes g4 as played in the game, and this move is tremendously strong. It hits the knight on f2, it forces the knight back somewhere in the game, rook 2 to f4 played, and now we finally have that key move c4, that king's Indian defense style move for white. And the point is, now the queen and even the rook on a1 have access to the king side via the third rank. So sort of a queen lift on the third rank. The queen will be sliding over, and that queen will aid both in defense of the white king and in offense against the black king, as again, that king is just utterly naked on the king side. All right, now here, black, what should he be doing? Well, it turns out e takes d5 is the right way forward. That is the best defensive move. But instead here, b takes c4 played. And here, Fabiano Caruana demonstrates why he is a perennial top 5 player. He does not take on c4. Instead, he slides the queen over to g3, ignoring the free pawn. Queen g3 played in the game. And now there are all kinds of ideas. For example, knight f6 being the most deadly, hitting the king on g8 with the knight and the queen, and then you would pick up the queen on d7, winning the game. Therefore, black has to respond immediately to this threat. And what is it going to be? Well, there are a lot of ways to defend. For example, king h7, king h8, or h7, then h8, and also bishop to g5 are playable. And in the game, king to h7 chosen by the GOAT. Now we have queen to h3, sliding over the queen, hitting the king g8 played by Magnus. And then finally, that rook lift on the third rank, rook to a3. The rook is going to be sliding over potentially to the g3 square, and this will get very deadly as both the rook and the queen will be just cutting off all lines of retreat of the black king. All right, Magnus, he tries to defend. He goes bishop to g5, a decent defensive move. We've seen this idea throughout this game as being a good candidate move, but now here, rook to g3, all the same, doubling up pressure with the rook and the queen on the h and g files. Now, Magnus, queen g7, he tries to block the g file with the queen, but this is an inherently risky decision as now the queen is in front of the king and opposing the white rook on g3. This will get very dangerous. I mean, imagine the bishop and the knight leaving the board. He would lose the queen potentially on the spot. All right, now here, sure enough, Fabiano Caruana, knight to f3, pressuring that bishop on g5, trying to remove that piece from the g file. And here, Magnus, he is not gonna, sit by on the sidelines and wait while he gets blown off the board. Instead, Magnus has a beautiful idea right here in this position to try and stay in this game. Again, if you like, pause the video right now. Try to find this key idea. All right, Magnus, right here. The move is rook takes f3, the exchange / rook sacrifice. What is the idea here? If you take back with the rook, that would be quite a bit weaker, and black would have some counterplay after rook takes, queen takes, e takes d5, and black would be fighting back in the game. Instead here, g takes f3 played in the game. That is the right recapturing with the pawn, and you don't have to worry about the g file opening up as, again, your rook on g3 controls that file for now. All right, Magnus, he knows he's got to get his king away from the king side. He goes king to f7. His king is running away, but is it too little too late? Here, Fabiano, knight to f2, retreating the knight, and again, getting one step closer to having the discovered attack of the rook on the queen on g7. Now, king to e7, the ball and cloud move. The king continues to run away from the king side, and now we have rook to c1. Fabiano threatening rook takes c4, but in the process, of course, the rook could be taken, but of course, that bishop on g5 is pinned to the queen on g7, so if you take the rook, then you lose the queen. So for now, that rook is safe, and it is threatening rook takes c4, opening up another potential line of attack against the black king on the e7 square. All right, now here, Magnus. It turns out here, the best move to try and stay in the game, believe it or not, is actually rook takes f3. That would have been an absolutely insane move. The point being, if you take the rook on f3, then you can actually go bishop takes c1, as the rook was deflected from the g file, and it could no longer take on g7 as it's over on the f3 square. So rook takes f3, again intending rook takes, then bishop takes c1 would be the best defensive resource. Instead, rook to h8 played in the game, hitting the queen on h3 with the rook. Now we have queen to g4 and knight to f7. Magnus bringing his knight into the defense. But now we have rook takes c4 all the same. Here, Fabiano threatening rook takes c7, hitting the king on e7 and winning a pawn. That attack would be just way too strong. So Magnus, how will he defend here? Well, it turns out c5 is the best defensive resource. Yes, white can recapture en passant, but overall, after rook to c8, black may be hanging on. Instead, in the game, king d8 chosen by the GOAT. But here, Fabiano Caruana, he plays the last move of the game. He just goes d takes e6, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigns on the spot to Fabiano Caruana. The point being that bishop on g5 is being overloaded. Once the knight moves off f7, let's say it goes to h6, or that's about the only square it can go to, h6, then immediately you just take on g5. The queens come off the board after queen takes, rook takes, and white has a completely winning endgame, being up a piece, up the exchange, and up a pawn. That would just be way too much material. So for that reason here, Magnus Carlsen resigns on the spot to Fabiano Caruana. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Fabiano in the 2023 CCT Finals. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here for more Magnus versus Fabiano Caruana action. If you enjoyed this video, check that one out as well. I'm sure you'll like it, and I'll see you in the next video.